waiting for you to. Welcome everyone. This is our second TOK panel discussion on the 2023 prescribed titles. Today's conversation will be about title number 2, which is for artists and natural scientists, which is more important? What can be explained or what cannot be explained? Discussed with reference to the arts and the natural sciences. I'm Mr. Markowitz, your moderator. I'm happy to have two of our year 2 students, Sam on my right, Amelia on my left. We have literature teacher, Ms. Whitebright, from the arts department, Mr. Vilari, and our TOK teacher, Mr. J. I want to start in this title with the word explanation. So I'm just going to read the title again, just so we have it. It says, for artists and natural scientists, which is more important? What can be explained or what cannot be explained? So the first question I have for the panel is, what exactly is an explanation? And is an explanation different from a description or from a justification?
Perhaps I'll interject first, if that's all right. I think description is a good contrast term for us because I'm inclined to say mere description. I think explanations probably have descriptions within them, but it's kind of a skeletal beginning of what an explanation requires. And maybe a good start for us in what an explanation is it answers a why question. So we do have to be asking a why question, as opposed to mere description that can just kind of answer the what, perhaps, and tell us how things are or happen to be. But if we're really asking a why question, then we're getting closer to an explanation.
I think if I can throw my hat in here. In IB theater, describe and explain are actually command terms. Those make the difference between a 4 and a 5, or in the points you get for the assignments that they have to do, and that's exactly the sort of dividing factor. An explanation needs to have either a why or a how question answered, whereas a description is just a what, and it can be very exhaustive. It's good. It's the step below the top level, but explanation needs to give a how or a why in terms of IB theater, and I think ultimately that seems to me like a good, even everyday sort of unpacking of what is an explanation.
Okay, other thoughts about that?
I think too, with the explanation, I definitely put like, what's the purpose of the explanation? So obviously if it is for like an IB task, they'll typically say, explain why or explain how, right? There will always be kind of that term after so that you know what the purpose is of that explanation. But just the word explanation, I feel like that could be a ton of different things. And so you have to figure out what is the purpose of an explanation before even diving into just what is it. Because if you don't know the reason someone is explaining something to you, right, or the reason someone has asked for an explanation, then I think you end up with very, very different kind of ideas, right, and very different ways to express those ideas. So I think like the purpose behind it is incredibly important. Also too, right along with purpose is always the audience, right? Who are you explaining it to? The way that I would give an explanation to a 2-year-old child would be very different than the way that I would give an explanation to, a senior in high school or something like that.
So is everyone on the panel sort of okay with the basic idea that explanations deal with the how and why, and the descriptions deal with the what?
Yeah, I was gonna what I wrote down is adding to is the point or the objective of an explanation is to make it better understood, whatever you're explaining, and then the definition description is I think what you said is more what, and then maybe justification as like subjective language, right? So that's maybe or the other two don't imply that it's supposed to be made more clear or better understood rather than explanation, I guess. That's my point.
The next kind of question I wanted to ask, which I think when we talk about the AOKs is going to be really important, is we typically think of explanations as verbal. We use words to offer an explanation. Is there such a thing as an explanation that is non-verbal? Is it possible to explain something without the use of words? I think that's going to be really important, especially when we get to the arts.
I think this dives in a bit more into like body language, for example. A lot of people, they're not very verbal or descriptive. They mostly like describe their emotion with body language. So I think there's a lot of, especially with the arts, by just looking at something or looking at people's reaction to something, it can have like it is relevant to like something not having, that all explanation are not verbal.
I would absolutely agree with that. Like, there's a lot in the arts where the explanation needs to be, needs to live within the action itself that is being performed. So whether I am teaching you how to mix color, or I am trying to explain to you how two notes sound together in a scale, I can describe with words, but I can only explain with an example. And that example is, by its own nature, nonverbal. And if we go back to our definition of the explanation has to do with maybe answering a how question, then showing something and having someone mimic something can be described as an explanation that requires no verbiage, no words whatsoever.
Would you, I wonder, when we get to the arts, we'll talk more about this, but I wonder if you would consider a performance, an actor's performance, a kind of explanation?
That very much depends on, I'm gonna piggyback on what Ms. Wegbert said, which it depends on what the goal is. What are you trying to do, right? What is the goal of the performance? So for example, as a teacher, I will sometimes perform something with the pure intent of demonstrating to my students how to perform a task, an activity, a skill. With my class today, we're learning how to do minor stunts and stage combat. I will perform something to demonstrate it so that they learn how to do it. So yes, that's an explanation. If I were to do the same stunt during a performance of a play, then no, because I'm not trying to explain the how or the why, I'm trying to communicate a story, and that's a different beast altogether.
But at the same time, are you trying to explain an experience or explain a feeling? Then wouldn't the performance still be an explanation?
Possibly, and again, so that depends on the goal of the performance and depends on what you're trying to do with the performance, who your audience is.
Mhm.
So I'm
Yeah.
re-saying what you just said already, so I'll just do like what she said.
Mhm.
It was perfect, because it's true, like,
Mhm.
who is your audience and what you're trying to communicate to your audience defines whether or not this is an explanation.
The other important distinction, well, actually there are two. The other important word that the title uses is actually important. It says, which is more important, what can be explained or what cannot be explained. And we might think about how we would know that something is important, or even how we would define the word important. I suppose something can be important in that it motivates further research. It can be important in that it somehow enriches the field of study. Aside from the two things that I just mentioned, any other sort of different senses of the word important that we might want to consider?
I found it interesting that they didn't use like the word effective, right?
Effective.
Because to me, important can, that can have individual meaning, right? Something important to me doesn't have to be important to Amelia, right? And so I found that was really interesting because it kind of makes us rank it, right? Which is more or less, right? And so I found that was just something that like, importance can't be proved as much as like how effective something is, right? So like, I could say a performance was effective in making me feel something, but like a performance could be way more important to me just because it is, right? Like I don't know if there's so much a way to prove importance as much as there would be effect on the audience, right? Or effect in getting the purpose across, right? And so that word importance to me makes it feel much more individualistic.
It's definitely a word that has a value judgment in there, and that value judgment is probably gonna depend on the individual.
Yeah.
I might add that when we turn to sciences, constructing new or larger frameworks, that could be an aspect of importance too. Yeah.
Okay, I think I want to go into the arts, and what I want to do for each AOK is just ask the basic question of the title for each of the AOKs. So we'll start with the arts, and the question is, which is more important in the arts? What can be explained or what cannot be explained? Just hoping to go to each panelist and have you respond to that question. So, Ms. Webb-Bright, in the arts, what is more important? Or which is more important? What can be explained or what cannot be explained?
I wrote on my sheet that they're equal, but I know that you can't say that, right?
Might be able to say that.
Okay, to me, I do think that they're equally as important, especially within, you know, the arts, within literature, within the way we interact with texts. I think that, like, the way that something makes me feel might not ever be able to be explained, right? I might not be able to truly understand why I'm, you know, hysterically sobbing over something that happened in a book, right? But I think that that feeling is just as important as something that could be better explained. And so to me, again, it's more about like the impact than necessarily the explanation. And so I think at the end of the day, they're both equally important, right? I also thought about this not just in terms of like literature, but also just in terms of language, how we have a word for something in you know, German that we don't have a word for in English. Just because we don't have that word in English, does that mean that I can't understand or explain the word that they have in German? Probably not, right? I can still explain it, it's just gonna be in very different language.
It's interesting to bring up the whole idea of translation, because in a way, maybe a translation is an explanation
Right.
also.
Exactly.
Amelia, what would you say? In the arts, which is more important? What can be explained or what can't be explained?
I agree with everything Ms. Whitebird said. I'm a bit on the like side of the perspective that it can be sort of equal sometimes, but I like the idea within the arts that what cannot be explained is much more important or interesting, because in the arts you don't always look for the explanation, you look for the interpretation of the piece of art. If it's a painting or if it's a drama or whatever you're looking for, you don't always go to the first explanation, or you don't always look for what other people say. It's mostly within yourself. For like, if I see this work by Picasso, because I see the name there, it will be more about my own interpretation and what the artist tries to explain. Maybe later, if I want to dive into more research about this artwork, I'll be like, oh, so this is why he put this shape here or this shape there. It represents this for him, but for me, I interpreted it totally differently. So I think that in the arts, it's a lot about personal interpretations.
Are you kind of saying that like when somebody else explains a work of art to you, it kind of limits you or imposes on you, and so you're less able to interpret it yourself if someone else gives you the interpretation?
Definitely, you could still interpret it yourself, but you will have sort of a direction, or someone is leading you to the same conclusions that they have.
Yep, and we could talk about, one of the things I was gonna bring up in a little bit was this whole idea of when you go into a museum, you often have the work of art and then you have the explanation over to the side where they're sort of giving you the explanation of how you're supposed to interpret it. All right, Mr. Gulare, what cannot be explained in the arts or what can be explained, which is more important?
Well, I'm gonna go a step back and say, well, what are we trying to do? So if we're talking about becoming an artist, right? So if we're talking about the practice of teaching art, teaching art is a very weird way of saying mentoring and becoming an artist with the help of an established artist, and then the explanation there is kind of fundamental, right? I need to be able to explain to you how to do this thing in art, or I need to be able to figure out how to make something resonate. But if we move to the purpose of art itself, then I'm squarely in the camp of what cannot be explained is the essence of what the arts are doing. Ultimately, whatever art we are dealing with, be it literature, music, dance, film, theater, visual arts, whatever, what the arts deal with is beauty. And beauty cannot be explained, it can only be experienced. We can define parameters, we can say, you know, we can do statistics, but ultimately the concept of beauty is that which is subjective, is that which is experienced personally. So I can say, oh, this is very well proportioned, and I can explain to you why something might sound better than something else, but ultimately it is your personal experience of it that will determine whether or not you find it beautiful. So whether or not it is art, and to me that is the crux of it. Ultimately, art is what we as humans have developed to describe the ineffable, that which we cannot name. If we don't have a name for it in any language, then we do art for it. And that's what, to me, is the essence, the fundament of what artists do.
Okay, and I also like the distinction between something that can be explained versus something that has to be experienced. That those two things in some way are, if you explain something, you're in some way not experiencing it.
Well, I mean, you can explain it. There's back to literature, and there's two camps in Italian literature and how it should be taught in schools. And there's a camp that says just give them a book and let them read it. And there's a camp that says, oh, you need to do the context and study the author and figure out. And ultimately, you can argue for both. But you know, reading the biography of an author and finding out why they decided to write a certain book doesn't take away from the experience of the book itself. And you might find, you know, that all of the context makes perfect sense, but the book still sucks. Or you might find that the context makes absolutely no sense, but the book just speaks to you. And so the two things are separate, and they sort of live in two different worlds, and they don't necessarily take away one from the other as entities, if you know what I mean.
Yep. Okay, Sam, in the arts, what can be explained, what cannot be explained?
So I was gonna say that it depends on the artwork. Like if you have I mean, I wish I had an example, but I think like in children's books, besides you know, the function of obviously the intent of entertaining children, there is artistic intent in like the picture books. But I guess
You can chime in while you collect your
Yeah.
thoughts there, yeah. Yeah, so I think that what I'm thinking about right now in the arts is genres, and I'm constantly fascinated by genres, and I feel when we contrast to the sciences later on, of course natural science is geared towards progress, but in terms of capital P progress, I think of the arts as the most progressive field out of all of our AOKs. Like arts are like what really gives us progress ultimately. And I always find it fascinating, there's a certain formula, a magical formula that like often what's most progressive in the arts are the genre defying pieces. Whether it's literature or music or film or what have you. And so it almost becomes explicable there, like the reason for the progress, why that's happening. Like we almost have this magical formula, like, oh yeah, that's a good thing, ultimately. First it's rejected wildly, probably for a couple decades, but then 35 years later, we're like, oh yeah, that's super cool, because it was genre defying, and it progressed us sonically or you know, literarily. But, okay, so there, I'm playing a cheat game there because I'm explaining, I don't know, something almost a scientific phenomenon that's occurring concurrently with the progress of the arts. So I think it's unfair, my answer there, and in any case, I would have to agree with Mr. V. I think that this ineffability does seem to be the essence of the arts in general. So I would have to say that cannot be explained. I'm more or less in that camp as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to introduce a sort of well-known quote. I think two different people get credit for it, Miles Davis and Frank Zappa and maybe some others. And the quote goes like this. It says, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. So I want to think about this because it seems to be saying that reducing an art like music to words or explaining it in words would be to reduce it in some way or to not do it justice. So I want to think about if there's ever a case in which the explanation of a work of art conveys the artist's meaning as effectively as the work of art itself. Is that something that does or could happen?
Well, so the first thing that came to my mind was the idea of like spark notes or Cliff's notes,
Yeah.
right? These are,
Which for those who don't know is where you don't want to read the book that you're assigned, so you
Yeah.
read somebody else's description.
Which
Yeah.
is not what you IB students are doing.
Yeah, nobody here has ever done that.
right.
Yeah.
And so while like, so as like an EAL teacher, I do feel like I often say, you know, if you're not understanding, right? If you're not understanding what it is you're reading, Spark Notes, Cliff's Notes, those are great tools for understanding. However, they cannot and will never replace the actual prose, right? Well, they will never replace the actual literature that your teachers are trying to expose you to, no matter how hard they try to explain it away, right? That definitely was something that came to my mind with this quote. But then as you were explaining it here, I was also thinking about the idea of adaptation. So when, you know, a book becomes a film or a book becomes a TV show, do they get the meaning across better?
I just want to emphasize,
Yeah.
you just use a phrase, Ms. Whitbright, which I think is really helpful for us right now, explain it away
Oh,
as an
okay.
idiom.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, maybe we can amplify some of the sentiments we already shared, like, this is interesting, and you've got me
Yeah.
thinking that, like,
Mhm.
maybe it's not so much, like we were saying, like, okay, the essence of the arts is the ineffable, that cannot be explained, but maybe even further so, explanation itself can serve as an obstacle to getting at that essence.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
explain it away.
I mean,
Yeah.
and that's something like kind of like what you said about Italian, you know, literature education.
Right.
That's always been the question for me is how much do I really want to discuss it in class, because I don't want my opinion of the literature to impact the way that students end up interpreting and interacting with that text, because I want them to be able to come to their own conclusions and feel their own feelings about it. And if they want to throw the book across the room, great, like
Right.
do that, you
Yeah.
know? Just because I love it doesn't mean you have to love it, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I do often, you know, get into that, again, how much are teachers explaining it away, right? How much are, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's definitely an interesting.
Yeah.
sentiment.
I think for teachers it's more tricky because there's also this question of purpose to what
Right.
do you want the children that you're actually teaching, where should they go, what level or what are the expectations for them. For example, in IB English, how much should the teacher actually guide you through your analysis of the book so that you can actually do well during your exams or understand what you're actually supposed to do and be able to reflect on it. So I think there's sort of like a
We have to do both.
Yeah, and to me, like, again, I'll go back to those two things don't have to live in separate, like, don't have to influence one another. They live in separate worlds. They have to live in separate worlds. You know, when I teach in my Italian literature class, I've had situations where, like, we're reading poetry, and so I'll read a poem, and my students will go, I'll say, so what do you think? And they're like, oh, I understood nothing, it was beautiful. And that to me is like, okay, good, that's a good place to start, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah.
Now let's unpack it, and when we go and unpack it, that doesn't take away any of the initial beauty. It just gives the students the tools to be able to figure out some of the how, so that explanation that we were talking about before, right? So in terms of like, now they are able to do a critique, they're able to speak as to what it is that they have in front of them and how it works. But this doesn't replace the thing itself, right? It does not replace the experience of reading the poem. It doesn't replace the experience of playing the music. So in your question, like, is there ever something that is not art that can do the work of the art? And no, there isn't. However, that doesn't mean you can't write about music. The same way that there's nothing to say that you can't dance about architecture.
Yeah, yeah.
Because why not, right? And ultimately, it has been done. There has been dance inspired by architecture. Is it explaining how the architecture works? No, it's a different thing, but why not? So why not write about music? Why not dance about architecture?
The other version of that quote said, writing about music is like singing about economics. So perhaps you could do that too.
Yeah, and again, it has been done. Hold on, I'm trying to think. There's a specific artist that I'm thinking of that has done exactly that. Oh, but it's escaping me. But
The Bard of Economics.
Google it. It's
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
You were gonna say?
I don't know, what was I gonna say? Oh, well, music reviews. Yeah, writing about music, I agree. Like, there's something perhaps doesn't convey the artist's meaning,
I mean,
but
the review thing. So if you're reading a review,
yeah,
does that replace the experience of going to listen to the concert, see the movie, read the book? No. It informs you to some things, and it might help you, for example, decide what you want or not want to do, because it's a personal experience. And so reading somebody else's personal experience of it can inform you into making a decision of what you want to do. That serves a very important purpose, but it doesn't replace the experience. When you're reading a book review, you're not reading the book review so you don't have to read the book. I know what's happening. I read the
Yeah.
summary, done.
yeah,
You're reading the book review to find out whether or not you want to read the book.
right. And in particular, record reviews, album reviews, like, the best review writers, perhaps they're not capturing what it is, like sonically, to experience the album. They're not capturing that by any means. But the best reviews I've ever read, like, I always walk away like, wow, that was an artistic performance. Like, I'm heavily moved emotionally. So it's not like back to this idiom of explaining it away. Like, they've done a really good job of not like reducing the lyrics to some like formula or whatever. So it preserves, yeah, I mean, this quote is a good one. I think there's a way where we can translate between medium and the arts that preserve the, almost like the emotional intensity, perhaps, of the particular art. I don't know if I want to say that. I'm provisionally saying that, but not capturing the essence of the original art form. Yeah.
I think even this notion that explanation in the arts might possibly detract or not substitute for the experience is an interesting segue, because I don't think we're going to find this in the sciences. I don't think we're going to find that explanations detract from any kind of experience or understanding, but let's see. So I want to start with the
Jethro Tull,
Jethro Tull.
which again, not only so the name of the band is that of an economist in the 1600s, but they have an album that is entirely based on the oil prices in the 70s. So singing about economy right there.
Interesting.
I knew I had
There we
that.
You got it, Jethro Tull.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the natural sciences, I want to start with the British Council decided a couple of years ago to define science, and they defined it this way. It says, science is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So if the scientific method is all about coming up with a plausible explanation for an observed phenomenon, does that mean that if something can't be explained, it's outside the realm of science? That if something can is outside what can be explained, that science cannot deal with it, or it's more appropriate for another area of knowledge than science. Mr. J, I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it points at a long relationship between, let's say, philosophy and sciences, where, and the picture is often perhaps a question or a topic is in the philosopher's hand to massage it into form until it's ready to be taken by the scientists to properly test it and everything they do. So I think there is definitely a gatekeeping mechanism, like something that's unexplainable in principle, let alone ineffable. It's almost by definition, according to the British Council, not within the purview of the natural sciences. But again, like thinking about philosophy, which is not necessarily part of the arts, like that question could very well be entertainable and, you know, formed into something that's more scientific. But I think it is fair to say that if it's not explainable in principle, then it's not scientific.
Okay.
Yeah, are we in agreement here? Yeah.
You say if it can't be explained, it's not so.
Yeah, if it's not explainable in principle, like it's ineffable, as Mr. V said earlier, then it's not going to be,
So I think
Yeah.
an interesting distinction here
Yeah.
is that of, do we agree that it is not, that it can't be proved, right? That it
Yeah.
can't be explained. So if
Yeah.
we know it can't be explained,
Yeah.
if that's a known quality of whatever we're talking about, then yeah, I agree. I don't think that pervades to science.
Yeah.
If it can't be explained yet,
right,
then we're in a very different
Yeah.
place, right? So
yeah,
we might not have the tools to explain it yet. That is exactly what drives science forward, right? I'm looking for that explanation. There's a very philosophical and super interesting concept in mathematics where we never know if something is true or not until we have proven whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
And we also don't know if it is provable. It might be true
Yeah.
and unprovable, right?
Okay.
Which confuses things, but if we're in that undefined space where we don't know whether something is explainable or
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
then it does belong to science until science has explained it, and then we know it's explainable, or until something else has told us that it is not explainable,
right,
and then it loses its scientific
right.
interest, I think.
Right. Yeah, and so like, I think that the kind of, usually we don't want to promote gatekeeping, right? This phenomenon of being gatekeeping, but there is kind of a gateway mechanism into science, and if it's, I think what we're saying right now is if a question, if we can see a way where it would eventually be explainable, then it's worthy of being designated as a scientific investigation. And otherwise, we just have to let it kind of marinate elsewhere for a while, if not, reject it entirely. But yeah, I do think that distinction between eventually explainable versus unexplainable in principle is supremely important in the sciences.
I think maybe I'll kind of just introduce a concrete example, just so we can figure out this distinction between something that's currently not explained versus unexplainable. So in medicine, you have diseases that are known as idiopathic diseases. We don't know what the cause is. So examples include Alzheimer's disease, ADHD, migraines. Those are poorly understood diseases. We don't know what causes them. So I guess the question for the panelists is, if you're a medical researcher, how do you decide whether something is just currently unexplained or something is unexplainable? Thoughts about that? Difficult question, I know.
Well, I am not a scientist by any degree, but I have read a lot of books. And so, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it's exactly kind of what Mr. G was talking about, basically thinking about, can you run enough experiments? Can you try to get to the root of something? I think too, that's a lot of times why people go into science, is because they want the answer. And to me, I feel like it almost goes against that idea of the gatekeeping. It's like, no, anything can be science if you can run enough experiments, if you can do enough tests, if you can gather enough data, if you can, figure out a way to explain it. And I feel like that's a lot of times why people go into the sciences or become scientists, because they want the explanation, right? Like, there's so many stories, just stories of people who, had family members who, die of cancer, and then they go into cancer research, right? So not necessarily an idiopathic disease, but we're still searching, right?
Yeah.
And so just because we're still searching for answers doesn't necessarily mean it's unexplainable.
Yeah.
And to me, like, there's a simple, very simple, like, sort of litmus test to that question, which is, are we doing research on that? And the answer is yes. There are medical researchers that are trying to figure out what causes Alzheimer's, what causes ADHD, what causes migraines, and so that we can then eventually look for cures rather than just like, hey, you have a migraine, here, take this pill, it might make you feel a little better, but we still don't know what like, we know triggers maybe, right? We know things that can cause an episode, but we don't understand where the disease comes from. But we're looking into that, we're doing research into that, because maybe we will never find an answer, and we don't know that, but we know that maybe we can, and so it is worthy of research, it is science.
Yeah. On the flip side though, to push back a little bit, what you guys are saying, I think, again, it's in the philosopher's ball court to put these concepts under the microscope. Like what Mr. Markowitz is mentioning, these diagnostic categories, like ADHD in particular, scientifically as it stands right now, it's seemingly just this kind of constellation of symptoms that we've classified kind of ad hoc into a condition. And so a philosopher has the right to be highly suspicious of such ad hoc categories. Because normally we need something a little bit more coherent, holding what the philosopher would call natural tines together, things that like cut at the joints of nature. It doesn't seem, I'm more of a physicist than a doctor, but it doesn't seem, as far as I know right now, that ADHD cuts at the joints of neurological nature. It seems to be
But
kind of, yeah.
the question is not whether it is explained, the question
Yeah.
is whether or not it is worthy of being researched in case it is explainable. And
Right,
to
so-
me, so I completely agree, like, that's not,
Yeah,
that is not science, that is not established science yet.
right,
We're sort of feeling our way around, and we might come to figure out that we can't figure it out.
right.
We might come to figure out that, hey, we thought that this was this thing for the longest time, and look, it's these 5 separate things that we weren't even looking into. I mean,
Yeah.
for, miasmas, everybody, like,
Right,
1800s medicine
Right.
has been way
Right.
debunked.
right,
But it has been debunked because scientists looked into it, and what is accepted practice isn't necessarily established science
right,
yet,
right.
but it is something that we can look into with these scientific tools and eventually look for that explanation. Again,
Right.
since we're looking at is what's more important, what can be explained and what can't, right?
Yeah,
What can't be explained yet, but we think could be, is what is important
Yeah.
to science.
Yeah.
It sort of reminds me of what you were saying about like genre defying, right? Like, can't you kind of draw parallels between those two ideas? Like how something that was genre defying 35 years ago is seen as horrifying and horrible, and I can't believe anyone would ever try to do that.
Yeah.
But then 35 years later, it's considered revolutionary, right? Change the progression of the arts,
well, but that's a good contrast though. I mean, like, that's huge for the arts,
Mhm.
but we don't really want a genre-defined scientific concept, I would argue.
I don't know.
Like,
It's an interesting concept.
yeah, I think things are,
I mean, depending on what you're thinking, so for me, when vaccines were invented, those were genre defining.
Yeah,
That was not medically accepted practice, nobody thought it, like, they were ridiculed as quack medicine, and, you know, they saved millions of lives today, and that kind of like pushing and using what we accept as the scientific method, which again, the philosopher needs to define as what is the scientific method, but once we have defined that, once we have agreed that this is what we're looking into,
Yeah.
then the exploration of what possibly will be someday explained is, to me, the purview of sciences.
Mhm. Yeah,
What, I'm just curious, 'cause, like you say that all the stuff that is yet to be explained, but could potentially be explained. The other thing, like that, if it can't be explained in the sciences, does it mean that there's nothing to do with the sciences? Is that what is that the alternative one?
That's what the definition says, right?
Right.
According to the British Council.
But what does it look like then?
Right, then where does it go?
It's,
Does it flip
yeah,
into
I think
philosophy?
I think it goes back into the arts, it goes back into philosophy, it goes back into something else, like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
can you explain beauty? I go back to that, right? And,
Yeah.
no, you can tell me what your experience is of it, you can describe it, but can you explain it? And if you can't, and if we agree that, no, that's just something we can't explain, and until somebody comes to me and says, actually, I can, at which point I'll be like, okay, so maybe there's a lot more overlap between this field and that field, but until that happens, to me, beauty is unexplainable and something that has zero to do with science. Scientists don't deal with beauty, scientists deal with what can or should or will eventually be explained.
So if scientists decide that something is unexplainable, is it time for them to call the artists and say, this is your job?
If it's an import, I think the artists are gonna already be there. Like, you know, like,
After all,
we're ahead of you, I have a musical based on it. Like, you know,
Sigmund Freud, not the greatest scientist in the world, did say that wherever he goes, he has found that the poet has been there before him.
Right.
So perhaps the artists are already there when the scientists.
So here with these kind of like examples, we're diving more, I feel like, from my perspective, I know more about human sciences than actual natural sciences, but we're kind of diving into like a human science perspective, for example. Now you just mentioned Sigmund Freud, like more of a psychological perspective or more anthropology perspective than the actual natural sciences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which does transition us more so into natural sciences. Mr. Marcos, if you were gonna ask us the same question again from the PT about natural sciences in particular,
Yeah.
I would have to say that contrary to my answer with the arts, I think what can be explained in the natural sciences is probably more important to my mind. And first and foremost, due to the severe constraints it puts on our theorizing. Like we need to carry along this baggage back to this notion of progress. Like it's this huge bulk and baggage that we have to carry continuously onward, and it puts this straitjacket on us. And if the theorist was to completely ignore what can be explained, then their theorizing would be completely unhinged and unproductive. So I fit as squarely as I fit in with the other side for the arts. I think I equally fit as squarely with the sciences on the other side.
And maybe I'll put that basic question of the prescribed title to the other panelists as well. So in the natural sciences, what is more important? What can be explained or what cannot be explained?
For this one, I actually think I'm on the opposite side. I think that what cannot be explained is more important because otherwise we wouldn't have research, right? We wouldn't have those reasons to learn more about our natural world, to learn more about, everything that we don't yet know, right? We would still be thinking the world is flat. We wouldn't know about gravity. We wouldn't, right? If we constantly were just thinking about what exactly can be explained, I think we would still have so many more questions than answers.
the unexplained is the impetus for
the natural
progress.
sciences. Yeah.
I would definitely agree with Ms. Barber. What can be explained is that the essence of any science, because that's what you strive for. You want to explain, for example, how this marker was done, or like how is the ink done. Or, I don't know how scientific this is at this moment, but what strives people to be motivated to actually find new things or new things to actually find an explanation for is what they cannot explain. For example, cancer research, they've gotten a lot of explanation out of it, or they've progressed a lot in it, because they're always striving for what cannot be explained, like why is this happening when we do like X, Y, Z, when we put X, and why does Z happen, or when we change these variables, this happens. Is this progress or not progress? It's, like she said, it's why what cannot be explained that actually creates the whole natural science sort of.
Yeah, I mean, back to earlier what Ms. Markowitz said about these different senses of importance. I mean, there is a sense that I think both of you are highlighting about motivating research. And I will say that's disproportionately highlighted in popular media, in particular physics, my favorite science, where it's always about the mysterious, the unknown, what cannot be explained. That's all we ever read about in pop articles and TV shows.
Right, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Right. So there's already a little bit of a bias going on there. But I do agree in terms of motivating research in these questions. Surely that is a massive driving force, if not the driving force behind the progress of science. But again, back to what you started with, Ms. Spoke, right? This kind of ranking that the PT forces us to do. Like for me, from a physics perspective, as motivating and as important as that is, it's in the context of this massive, overwhelming situation of what can be explained, like that baggage I referred to. And in physics, we've got these two massive theories, the most empirically supported theories we've ever had in the history of mankind, in quantum theory and our theory of gravity. And we know they're not the final answer. That's the whole project in physics right now, how to unify them. But any theorist that comes out of grad school wanting to pursue that project, they're deeply constrained. They can't just come up with any random idea. Well, they can, but then their advisor stops talking to them. And, but otherwise, they're so severely constrained by what we do know and can explain. And the other thing I love too is that often in physics, we end up explaining old theories that aren't so cool anymore, according to Neil deGrasse Tyson in popular media, because it's like classical physics, right? Like we're well beyond that. We've got all these fancy new theories. But actually, we can explain classical physics like really well now, so much better than we used to be able to. And that's really important for the project of physics too, because if we explain the old stuff better, guess what? It gives us a more nuanced window into what that mysterious ingredient is when we try to touch upon that cannot be explained. So back to this kind of ranking, and again, I agree, it's unfortunate that the PT forces to do this, but I think within physics, I would still have to kind of bow to what can be explained.
I think too, it's really important to note that like when I'm ranking this, right, for the natural sciences, I'm coming at this from a literature background, right? So for me, I'm like, oh, what we don't know creates such awesome speculative fiction, right? All the multiverses, all the, everything, like I think of these amazing films that we've gotten out of the lack of knowledge, right? The lack of explanation from scientific phenomenon that has produced great art, right? And so I think that's also where my ranking comes in to play, right? Whereas if I were more scientific, right, or coming from a more scientific background or experience, I might do the exact opposite, right? Oh, ridiculous science fiction, how crazy, right? But for me, it's like what I love.
Your last comment reminded me there was a prescribed title a couple of years ago that had a Picasso quote that said, "Others have seen what is and asked why. I have seen what could be and asked why not." So literature is speculative or imaginative, of course, in a way that science maybe less so.
And we do get nice fusions once in a while. So I'm thinking of the film Interstellar, which, if I recall correctly, they did hire a professional physicist and their crew, and they ended up simulating black hole dynamics, and we actually learned new science from this otherwise artistic
Oh,
creation.
that's really
So there's a nice fusion of our two AOKs here in action there. Yeah, and there's a case of something that definitely cannot be explained within current natural science. But it's still, cannot be explained in principle, as we said. Like, there's something enough there, as mysterious as these objects are, there's something that makes it testable, which the philosopher might push back here, because technically, like, we go past the event horizon of a black hole, which is the point of no return. It's like, how are we testing the dynamics of such a thing that we can't, like, report back on if we were to kind of, so there are questions to be had there, but I think it is on the border of that distinction, yeah.
All right, so maybe that's a good time to maybe wrap it up, and please join me in applauding our panelists. And we would love, our huge audience here, we would love if you have questions for any of the panelists.
Like, I don't have a question, but I was thinking, like, I agree that somehow it's more important what cannot be explained, because as all of you said, for example, for science, like, it's like what cannot be explained is what makes science, because you discover new things every day, and like technology and everything, that's like the essence. Or I was also thinking about religion. The whole point is like what cannot be explained, because it's all about faith. So yeah, I was thinking it's like a really important aspect. I will say it's somehow important, more important than like what can be explained. And yeah.
Well, I would highlight there, what's fascinating to me, Milka, is that contemporary scientists, again, I'm biased, I'm always thinking of physicists, I'm sorry, that's my background, but contemporary physicists, let's say, they liked, many of them, including the particular man that Mr. Egbert mentioned earlier, they're very proud of their so-called atheism, and they think that there's this definite divide between physics and religion. But what I find ironic and fascinating is that contemporary physics, there's one direction where we've moved into this picture of a computational universe. The universe is just more computer code that follows certain algorithms and stuff like that. And plenty of these atheistic physicists buy into this picture, and they investigate it, and they go further and further in that logical direction. And then what do they eventually land upon? They're like, our universe is a computer program, then is there a programmer? And then they're like, oh crap, that sounds like a god. And so they get kind of pushed into this position where they're probably not proud to say it, but they start entertaining these theistic ideas. And so, yeah, it's nice that you're touching upon these. I think there are religious elements that can properly enter into science, even with this gateway mechanism we described of like, if something can't be testable in principle, then it's not part of science. But, you know, I think those two ways of knowing and AOKs can be compatible, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now I actually have a question. Like,
Yeah.
So, you were talking about science, and that it tries to explain things, like that's the whole point. But then, why do you think it like crushes a lot with religion? Because, you know, for example, the theory of like how life got to like exist. In science, they put like the Big Bang theory, but it's not actually the answer to like how life exists. It's just saying, because you know, there's the matter cannot be created or destroyed, and they're not answering. They're just saying there was something that created everything, but like that something is for like of everything. So where did that come from?
Yeah.
And then like, but they also are like the scientific part, like they're too close to like believe religion, like, which sounds in a way like more to an answer. They are saying, oh, there was someone before that created everything, which is God. It's a all-powerful being. But like, why do you think they're too close to believe, like in religion? Like, why are they not working together? I don't know, like if that makes any sense.
I could try and stab that, as, and about agnostic, because religion does not come without boundaries. So if you're asking why would a scientist not believe in God, I'm gonna ask you, which God should they believe in? And religion is not theism. Religion comes with one of many books, one of many systems, and in history, we have seen those clash with progress and with ideas that don't fit within a prescribed, hard box, right? This is how the world is, and if something deviates from what I say that this is how the world is, then that is hereticism, and it has not gone well for the scientists of the world, right? So I don't think that there is an inherent atheism in science, but there is an inherent churchism in science. It is hard to prescribe to any one church, to any one particular version of theism. And that kind of goes both ways, because the science tends to disprove some of the things that the church defines, and the church requires unconditional belief. Faith is, by definition, unconditional belief. And again, in most cases, most churches require faith, which is, I think, where that clash comes out of.
I think I have a very different point. Sort of like similar to yours, but religion has, for like a very long time, always, it's been sort of the challenge or the motivation of scientists, actually, because they've been wanting to prove religion wrong, or to challenge the aspects or the notions of religion. For example, I don't remember exactly his name, but the first person who I think he was Italian, his name started with G, who challenged the idea that the Earth was actually, the Earth was not the center of the solar system. And it was-
Galileo Galilei.
Yeah, there you go, thank you.
Who was not the first one, because he was
There was a
copying
guy
Euler and
Copernicus.
Copernicus, right?
It was the guy before, but
But,
he
but yeah,
went
it
to
would seem more of
Russia.
it.
So, for example, that he challenged the church's idea and faith about like Earth not being the center of the solar system. And you can see it throughout, like with also Genesis, every single religion has their own theory of how the Earth came, like how we started, and science has its other, like they have their own idea of it. So in some sense, if you see it, every religion, they all challenge themselves. So there could be a comparison that natural science is a type of like religion, it's just dived into scientific research.
I mean, I think it's interesting, like you quote Galileo, and Galileo was definitely religious. He believed in God. He believed firmly in the existence of God. He speaks about learning science as a way to learn the language of God. So while he's disproving some of the beliefs that the church holds fundamental, there's a beautiful play by a certain Bertolt Brecht about Galileo Galilei, and in one of the scenes, the clergy refuses to look into the telescope because we don't need to look at this, we know it's wrong because the Bible says so, right? So that clash, but that's exactly what I was saying. Galileo going against the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church at the time doesn't mean he is atheist, he is a firm believer. And I think interestingly, like going back to the prescribed title, there's what's explainable and what's not, what is not explainable. I think in a way I fall on the same side as Mr. J. Like the idea is, if it cannot be explained, like unless we put a yet there, unless we qualify that cannot be explained, then if it cannot be explained, it doesn't belong to science. It is not important for science. And to me, the example of that is when scientists have tried to do that. When scientists have said, okay, let's use the scientific method to prove the existence of God, and they have all failed miserably.
Yeah.
Because that is not science, right? The existence of God cannot be proven with science. It has to be accepted and
Yeah.
by faith, right? That is what you uphold. And every single scientist, even the most brilliant one, right? You have Cartesius, who's like the father of modern algebra, and who goes there and is like, here is no, it doesn't work. It doesn't add up. Logically, it doesn't work. You try to use science to prove something that cannot be explained, and you fail.
Yeah.
It's good literature,
Yeah, yeah,
but it's not good science.
yeah.
Thank you for that question, good question. Any other questions?
I was thinking actually, in our Spanish literature class, we are now analyzing different images and like the resources that they have. And I was having a conversation with our teacher, are we inventing what we are seeing in the image, or is it already being existed? Like, how can we determine whether it has been explained or not? Because I feel like we, as students, we try to explain things, but they already have been existed. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if what I'm reading has been done because they thought that, or they were using some resources, or they were just like writing, you know?
Well, I think that anyone who produces art is essentially giving meaning to the audience, right? So there's inherently two meanings here, right? The meaning that the author or the creator intended, but that has nothing to do with how someone interprets it, right? And so it could be, hopefully, right? If you're the creator, maybe you hope that that's what someone interprets as well and feels and whatnot. But ultimately, by producing art, you're giving the kind of the freedom, yeah, to the people, right, to the audience.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much to our panelists, thank you so much to the audience.
All right.
Thank you, Internet.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.